The problem that is usually labeled the problem of determinism versus free will has been considered by many thinkers, philosophers, and scientists as an absolutely unsolvable problem. Du Bois-Reymond, great German physiologist with a French name of the last century, made a list of 7 riddles of the universe, 4 of which he considered absolutely unsolvable, such as, for instance, the mind-body problem, the nature of matter and force, and the free will problem. My aim this afternoon is to show you that the free will problem maybe cannot be solved, but it can be dissolved. It can be resolved in the sense that the major crux of the problem, not the surrounding other issues, rests on a conceptual confusion. And once this conceptual confusion is clearly exhibited, put into the spotlight of full logical attention, the problem disappears, or it should disappear. So, while what I will try to expound here is by no means new, I have a few diagrams which are relatively new and which may help to explain things. What I have to tell you, I did not invent. You can find parts of it already in Crescas, a medieval philosopher, in Spinoza, not so much in his ethics, but in his letters to Oldenburg. You can find beginnings of it in Hobbes, certainly in Locke, and most certainly in Hume. And from there on out, in the empiricist philosophers such as Mill, in England last century, Schlick, Hobart, which is a pseudonym for Dickens and Miller, and others who have seen the light on this problem. Nevertheless, the problem remains controversial because I think the confusions are only too tempting. So what needs to be done is a sort of therapeutic job, not in the sense of psychotherapy, which after all has to attack emotional conflicts, most of them unconscious or at least subconscious, but logical tensions and logical conflicts, which I shall try to make as explicit as possible. In making the bold claim that the free will problem can be definitively, with finality, dissolved, I do not wish to appear immodest. First of all, I've already told you that I learned all this from great thinkers long before me. Secondly, I think that there are surrounding issues which are by no means completely resolved, especially the scientific ones concerning determinism and indeterminism, and these await further developments, and I will discuss the question later as to whether they are resolvable at all. That reminds me I should put on something more on the board to remind myself later on what I want to say. This will do. Now, most of you are familiar with what the issue is all about. The scientific evidence, ever since the great synthesis, the Newtonian synthesis of the 17th century, has tended to assert or to indicate the doctrine of determinism. And this means that the conception of nature on the part, particularly of astronomers, physicists, and to some extent even chemists and biologists, and later some psychologists, notably Freud, held the doctrine that whatever happens in the world, physical or mental, inorganic, organic, psychological or whatnot, that whatever happens in the world, whatever event occurs, is in principle strictly determined by antecedent conditions and would in principle be calculable by natural laws if we had the natural laws, if we knew them, if we could plug in the momentary conditions of that part of the universe in which we are interested, or if we want to take a big mouthful of the whole universe, and if we had the mathematics, maybe computer mathematics these days, to work out the calculations regarding predictions of things to come. The idea got hold of the scientific mind, although it was anticipated, of course, in theological and in metaphysical doctrines of foreordainment or predestination a long time ago. But in its scientific form, it got hold of the minds of great intellects such as Laplace, the great French mathematician and astronomer, who in his famous essay sur les probabilités, essay philosophique sur les probabilités, philosophical essay on probability, gave us his famous passage on the demon, or the superhuman intellect, which would know the complete, precise conditions of the world at a given moment, perhaps now, or 1,000 years ago, or 1 billion years ago, it doesn't matter. Physicists speak of that as the initial and boundary conditions. And then with the help of the natural laws, which Laplace, having lived toward the end of the 18th century, considered the Newtonian principles of mechanics and the law of gravitation, given these laws that determine the motion of every particle in the universe, we could predict, such a superhuman mind or demon could predict the course of events with full accuracy and with full certainty. This is called the story of Laplace's demon. Well, a lot of water has gone over the dam since, as most of you have heard. There are good reasons in 20th century physics to doubt such a strict determinism. But let's first follow out the so-called logic of the situation. If whatever happens in the world, including even the events in human organisms and in human minds, is strictly determined and in principle strictly predictable by natural laws, then how can we be held morally responsible for what we are doing? Take me, for instance. Here I stand before you, shooting off my mouth, and you might say what he's saying is wrong. Maybe what I'm going to say might even be criminal. And you might say we hold him responsible, to which a determinist sometimes answers, I couldn't help it. After all, billions of years ago in the prime nebula out of which the galaxy formed, out of which our solar system was made, and out of which this Earth of ours developed within the solar system, and upon this Earth, that mildew that we call organic life, and that tiny speck of organic life called Herbert Feigl, all this was written in the stars, so to speak, billions of years ago, was fixed and predetermined, so the slightest motion of my fingers, the merest inflection of my voice, the intonation, the very choice of my words, all this could have been predicted by a superhuman intellect. So how can you hold me morally responsible? How can you praise me or reward me? How can you blame me or punish me for whatever I'm doing if what I'm doing was inevitably the outcome of previous conditions and in principle calculable to a superhuman spirit? I indicate this by the red double arrow, horizontal double arrow in my diagram, which indicates the incompatibility that many traditional thinkers, by no means all, many traditional thinkers have found between the idea of free will or free choice, as I call it here, and the idea of determinism. Spinoza was of two minds on this. In the Ethics, he says only God is equipped with free will. Man merely has an illusion of free will, but whatever he does is strictly determined and therefore not free. In one of his letters to Oldenburg, which I took the trouble to look up some years ago, he changed his mind and realized that in a certain sense, the kind of free choice that you and I cherish, and that no doubt we possess on the basis of such testimony as immediate experience furnishes, is not only compatible with determinism, but presupposes it. This is my thesis this afternoon. I want to show to you by logical argument that whatever free choice, whatever free will we possess, and we may sometimes possess precious little, but we do possess some all the time, almost all the time, not only is compatible with a strict determinism, but presupposes at least a certain measure of determinism. So then the next question to be discussed is what happens when we get the indeterministic implications of modern science, according to which there is an element of absolute chance in the world. All this requires a little explication, and I will proceed to give you that as I go along. Now then, the scientific evidence seemed extremely strong, particularly to the physical scientists, and most particularly to the astronomers, who with Newtonian and later with Laplacian methods were indeed able and are still able to predict with a fantastic accuracy such events as the passing of Venus in front of the disk of the sun, the exact moment of its entry, the exact moment of its exit, or solar or lunar eclipses down to split-second accuracy for years ahead. This is impressive evidence for the validity of determinism, at least in the physical field. Now, of course, it becomes a little more questionable when you take more complex processes, such as the chemical ones, but chemists, certainly during the last century, were convinced that if you set up precisely the same conditions in the laboratory, in an experiment, then the outcome will be precisely the same. And if the outcome is not the same, presumably the conditions were changed somewhat, and you might be able to find independent evidence for this changed condition. With organic life, the problem is much greater and is certainly not solved today, because after all, if you take what laws we have in biology, for instance, Mendel's laws of inheritance, they are typically statistical. So it requires a speculative kind of reasoning, a vast extrapolation to assume that the world as a whole, including not only astronomical and mechanical and physical processes, but also organic, biological ones, and psychological ones, are basically strictly deterministic, that there's a strict law and order in nature applying to whatever there is in the world of space and time, that causality reigns supreme. This is the idea of strict determinism. I have indicated these speculative extrapolations by wavy white arrows, one leading from the scientific evidence to the doctrine of determinism, the other one to the doctrine of indeterminism. I will have to discuss the latter one, that diagonal one, a little later. Now, let's look at the other side of the picture. The testimony of my own immediate experience seems to tell me that I have free choice. If I resolve right now to raise my left hand, I can do it. If I resolve to raise my right hand, I do it again. If on my way from the office to the union, I have the choice between going on the right side or the left side of the mall, maybe habitually I'm a leftist and choose the left side, but I could just as well have chosen the right one if I come from Northrop Auditorium, center there, you see, center door. It makes no difference, so I could freely choose. Of course, these choices do not seem very significant for our life. The kind of choices that, for instance, the existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre have been philosophizing about are those moments of life where we are on the knife edge of decision and where something rather more momentous in our life is to be decided. What to do with your life, what career to undertake, which girl to marry, and so on and so forth. These are more important decisions in our life, you see. So here, the testimony of our direct awareness or immediate experience seems to indicate indeterminism in that we feel free. Well, it seems to indicate, first of all, that we have free choice, and this is interpreted by many philosophers, again, not by all, by any means, as an indication of indeterminism, the red arrow leading down on the left side from free choice to indeterminism. Now, the conflict is clearly indicated by the horizontal arrow of the double arrow here, free choice versus determinism. This is what the philosophers have been puzzled about. And when the message of indeterminism of modern physics, particularly quantum mechanics, came to be broadcast, among philosophers and the wider public, a certain sense of jubilation arose in certain quarters. They said, now even the physical sciences have given up on strict determinism. That shows we can have free will. I will explode this idea in a moment. Not because I disbelieve in indeterminism, but because I think the reasoning is fallacious. So, on the left side, to summarize, we have the indications given by our direct experience, our own subjective impressions. We feel free, especially in deliberately making up our mind, making choices between alternatives. We think about possibilities. May they be as trivial as choosing a dish from a menu in a restaurant, or maybe they are as portentous as they might be in political action, in voting, in a decision that you make for your personal life, what to do with your personal life, and so on and so forth. Moreover, it does seem queer to hold anyone responsible for something he couldn't help doing. If he was forced to do it, then do we not consider him beyond responsibility? Do we not conceive responsibility in such a way that we call a person responsible if and only if he is responsive to, what shall I call it, the sanctions that society has to offer? That is, the kinds of rewards and punishments that society metes out to the agent, the doer of his deeds. Must we not be the doers of our deeds in order to be held responsible for them? And when I speak of rewards and punishments, I do not mean necessarily monetary reward or imprisonment or capital punishment or anything of that sort, or cruelty inflicted upon someone. Most of us have grown so sensitive to the context of common life that a mere frown on the forehead of a parent or a good friend may be taken as an indication of blame, of reproach, and that a smile, an approving smile, is taken like a reward. We are being, may I speak behavioristically for a moment, although I don't believe in behaviorism, we are being conditioned to respond in this way. So, this is what I have in mind by responsibility. We will have to go into this further and, if time permits, even discuss the purposes of punishment from the point of view of a philosophical resolution of this issue. Now, to come back to my main thesis, I maintain that the alleged incompatibility of free choice with determinism does not exist, that quite to the contrary, to the extent that we are free in our choices and in our actions, we must be the doers of our deeds and therefore be links in the causal chains, if you want to talk that way, that make up the processes involving our lives. But before I come to the denouement, which is indicated by the green arrows, the diagonals here, which in my diagram represent the justifiable, the correct incompatibilities, namely between free choice and compulsion and fatalism on the one hand, and between determinism and indeterminism on the other. Before I come to this denouement, let me discuss first the scientific issues of determinism and indeterminism as we view it from the point of view of 20th century science. There have always been thinkers since antiquity, at least since Epicurus, who have embraced some doctrine of absolute chance. To jump 2,000 years or more, Charles Sanders Peirce, outstanding philosopher here in America, founder of the pragmatist doctrine last century, he maintained the doctrine that he called tychism, T-Y-C-H-I, etc., tychism, which I'm poor at spelling, which is a doctrine of absolute chance. That is, he maintained, despite all the law and order that scientists, of course, find in nature, basically there are elements of absolute chance. So this requires a little logical clarification first on the concepts of chance themselves, and then a little, very all too brief discussion on the scientific evidence that has led 20th century physicists, at least the majority of them, to embrace a doctrine of indeterminism or of indeterminacy. I think it is useful to distinguish between relative and absolute chance. Relative chance is a concept that applies only within a deterministic scheme, that is, within a scheme of strict law and order and in principle predictability. Laplace's demon again, if he had all the intelligence and the computing facilities, etc. Not an omniscient being. All that the Laplacian demon needs to know is the momentary condition of the universe at a given time, throughout all of space, the laws of nature, and with the help of them and a lot of mathematics, he could grind out all about the future, as well as, if you're interested in the past, all about the past, you see. Now we grant this is a tremendous extrapolation. It is quite fantastic. It is speculative. That's why I have these wavy arrows, but it got hold of many minds. Now, given such a deterministic frame, we can speak only of relative chance, and to exemplify immediately, take, for instance, illustrations from what you might call a coincidence. I walk past that old ramshackle building called Eddy Hall, and a brick comes down from the roof and hits my head. So I say, what a coincidence. Just at that moment when I come by there, the brick has to hit my head. You see, if I had known the brick was coming down, if I had had even a small fraction of the Laplacian demon's knowledge, I would have known the brick was loose. I would have known that the last gust of wind would throw it down, and so on and so forth. And I would have avoided being there just at that second, you see. But my ignorance is such that I wouldn't have known about this, just as in the games of chance, if they're honestly played. Spin a coin, shoot craps, or anything of that sort. You don't know what the outcome on the dice will be, because you have made the conditions so complicated and also so sensitive that the smallest difference in the initial conditions makes a difference in the outcome, whether the die will show the 6 or the 5 or the 3 or the 1 and so on and so forth. All this we call relative chance in two senses. Relative to our knowledge and ignorance on the one hand, and relative also in this sense that we have here a crossing of causal lines, or to speak Einstein-Minkowskian language, a crossing of world lines. This is my world line. This is the moment when I reach the front stoop of Eddy Hall. This is the world line of the brick coming down from the roof, and here the two coincide. Then they may go apart again. Now, this is relative in the following sense. If I had stood on the sidewalk in front of Eddy Hall and hopped up and down like this, you might say, well, weak as Feigl is, and although he weighs only 165 pounds, he might have shaken Eddy Hall a bit, and he brought it on himself, you see. Then you would say, this is not a coincidence. Feigl done it. This is what you would say. So, but when events, so to speak, stem from causally independent conditions, then we would call it a real coincidence. Fancy, for instance, two tennis balls from neighboring courts. One game going on this court, one game on the other court, and they go out of bounds, the balls, and hit somewhere, collide in the air. I've played tennis for 30 years. I've never seen this, but conceivably it could happen, and a good mathematician could give you the probability of this very improbable event of two tennis balls from neighboring courts meeting in midair. So this would be a relative chance in both of these senses. We couldn't have known because our ignorance is usually so great. We are not Laplacian demons and superhuman minds. And secondly, we are dealing with events that stem from causally independent conditions. That's certainly true in the games of chance. That is true whenever you deal with events that are compared at a distance from each other, because on the basis of experience and what science we have, on the whole, we are convinced that if something happens right now in New York, this should not influence me here. You see, that these events are independent, events that are simultaneous. For those of you who know relativity, I'm talking about simultaneity within a given frame of reference. Never mind. Now, however, if the people who champion ESP and maintain that there is telepathy and clairvoyance, and if they moreover maintain that this is a sort of simultaneous action at the distance, then we might have to revise our scientific preconceptions and abandon some of the prejudices that have come with classical science and admit a curious correlation of events at the distance. I mention this not in order to make ESP more appetizing for you. I have grave doubts on the whole issue and I loathe the whole business, but I'm an empiricist, so at least I have to go through the motions of an open mind, don't I, on such things as mental telepathy or clairvoyance. So, these are the traditional concepts of determinism and the corresponding concept of relative chance. Now, absolute chance, of which Epicure thought in connection with the motion of the atoms, ever so slightly swerving from their preordained path, and of which Charles Sanders Peirce thought in his Tychism, this doctrine has come to life in modern physics, and particularly due to the quantum theory, as it was established first in the so-called quantum hypothesis by Max Planck in 1900. I can't take the time to give you the physics now. I will just give you an illustration or two. Basically, for my money, I'm jazzing it up a bit, this is the situation. When we come down to the atomic realm, when we deal with the interactions of molecules or atoms with each other, or of subatomic particles such as the electron or the positron or the proton or the alpha particle, the helium nucleus, and so on, with electromagnetic fields, with light waves, with X-rays, and so on, then according to the physics that was developed by Planck, Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Born, Jordan, Dirac, and others, this whole magnificent development of quantum theory and quantum mechanics, especially since 1926 with Heisenberg's and Schrödinger's contribution, indicates that possibly, not necessarily, that's why I have a wavy arrow here pointing from scientific evidence to indeterminism, that on the atomic and subatomic level there is possibly an element of absolute unpredictability, of disorder in a certain sense, of absolute chance. Now, some people reject this immediately by saying, oh, it must be relative chance. If we knew the conditions more precisely, then we could predict with full precision and certainty. Now, I am the last one to deny that science, at its best, strives for as much determinism as you can get. Because, after all, the task of science is prediction and explanation in this connection. You want to get as much predictability as possible, and along with that goes a maximum of explainability of phenomena that we observe. So it's a sort of sour grapes game that some scientists have played by saying, oh, well, statistical determinism is just as good as strict determinism. My eye. Of course, we may have to be satisfied with this. Maybe nature is such that it is at rock bottom, footnote on rock bottom coming up right away, that at rock bottom it is indeterministic. But how, let me make the footnote right now, it sticks in my mind. How would you know rock bottom when you see it? This is the question. Often a student asks me what from a philosophical point of view one should accept, determinism or indeterminism on the rock bottom of the world, to which I can only answer by another question. Would you know rock bottom when you saw it? Because, after all, modern physics, with its impressive devices, has dipped deeper and deeper into the micro world, has gone from the molecules to the atoms, to the subatomic particles, to the constituents of the nuclei of atoms, and so on and so forth. And who knows, the fleas have fleas on them that bite them, and so on ad infinitum. This could go on forever, you see. So if you consider the history of physics, let's say around 1870, to just give a date, no, wait a minute. First, 1850. The classical thermodynamics maintained that the so-called second law of thermodynamics is a strict law of nature. This is the famous law of the dissipation or degradation of energy. Now, in the 1880s, it was already clear that this law does not hold strictly, that it is a matter of probabilities. I can illustrate that very briefly. If you take an example from statistical mechanics, take the air in this room. As you all know, it consists mostly of nitrogen, oxygen, but of course a lot of CO2 and H2O also by now, since we've been here smoking and breathing. And now imagine that this mixture of whirling molecules of nitrogen and oxygen might unmix in such a fashion that all the oxygen goes that way and all the nitrogen assembles over here. You would poo-poo this as extremely improbable, just as you would poo-poo the possibility that, let's say, when Northrop is sold out one evening for a concert, that all the people that have for the beginning letter A to L in the last name will be on the left side, and those from M to Z on the right side. Not by design, not because tickets have been sold that way, but by chance. This is frightfully improbable. If this happened here, then you would burn your lungs in pure oxygen, would get your lungs burned in pure oxygen, and I would suffocate over here. So we don't expect that sort of thing. Nevertheless, when we, for instance, mix a white powder, let's say chalk powder, with soot, a black powder, of course we expect that the mixture will be more and more homogeneous gray. But a clever man long time ago said, well, suppose you keep stirring this for years and years, maybe millions of years, maybe sometime it will unmix again. Because after all, it's just like a deck of cards. If you shuffle it long enough, you might get back the original order from 1 to 52 in a bridge deck that you had as it came from the manufacturer. Probabilities are small already in the case of the deck of cards, and they are vanishingly small with the molecules in the air, because 1 cubic centimeter, if I remember correctly, contains 27 trillion molecules, and that's European trillions, millions. So you see the probabilities are fantastically small. Nevertheless, they are not zero. Therefore, the famous doctrine of the heat death of the universe, which the thermodynamicists of the last century proclaimed, namely that the free energy of the universe is running down, has been refuted, in that a resurrection from that heat death is at least physically conceivable. Not only logically conceivable, but physically conceivable, because the universe, even if it gets very mixed up, might unmix itself after a while. So, by 1880, we have a statistical interpretation of what was originally a deterministic law. But underneath, these same people, Maxwell, Boltzmann, and Gibbs, in England, Austria, and America, respectively, assumed a deterministic basis underneath, in that they assumed that the motion of the molecules themselves is strictly determined by the Newtonian laws. However, by 1900, and certainly by 1926, this was undermined by the modern quantum physics, according to which there's an element of absolute chance in the interaction of matter with matter and matter with radiation, as I told you before. Now, here we make the line because as of 1963, if I'm correctly informed and know the latest news of physics, we haven't got anything better but statistical laws, that is probability laws in physics. By probability laws, mind you, I don't mean the usual trivial thing, namely that all laws of science can be asserted only tentatively in the light of the evidence and therefore may be called more or less probable in the light of the evidence. That goes without saying. I mean an internal probability, not the usual external probability. An internal probability that is expressed in the law itself, as for instance in a simple rule of a game of chance when I say, if I cast this die, I have a probability of 1/6 of getting a 1. You see, if it's an honest die. If it's biased, then it may be a little different. So, a number of brilliant scientists, including the great Einstein himself, including the brilliant David Bohm, now in England, are looking for a restoration of determinism. But they haven't succeeded. Einstein, this is almost tragic, spent more than 30 years, the last 30 years of his life, on an enterprise of this sort and admitted, I talked with him a year before his death in Princeton, admitted that he had not succeeded. And the vast majority, I would say 95% at least, of modern physicists, the younger generation of physicists, believe that this was quixotic, utopian, that Einstein was chasing a chimera, that indeterminism is here to stay. I would not be quite so dogmatic because I think logically it's conceivable that this story might repeat down here. Of course, if it did repeat, who knows, this could happen again, and so on ad infinitum. Therefore, I recommend to philosophers not to make any pronouncements at all about determinism or indeterminism at the rock bottom of the world. First of all, because we have no criterion of rock bottom, therefore the whole thing is like an uncashed promissory note, is like a meaningless statement, or is a meaningless statement because you haven't defined your terms. And secondly, because the only sense in which it does make sense or is legitimate to speak of determinism or indeterminism is in the light of the laws that a given scientific theory asserts, let's say on good evidence. And all we can say that is, about this is that on the level of analysis that modern physics has reached, we haven't got anything better but statistical laws in microphysics. Now, to this, C.G. Darwin, who recently died, grandson of the great Darwin, Charles Darwin, but also an outstanding scientist, he was a theoretical physicist, to this, C.G. Darwin replied by saying, oh, well, even if we have basic indeterminacies on the micro level, they will cancel out on the macro level because of what is vulgarly called the law of large numbers. If you take populations of events with a great number of events, then of course you may get an excellent regularity on the macro surface, as we do, for instance, in thermodynamics, in the theory of gases, and so on. Those are pretty reliable laws. To be sure, closer examination shows certain fluctuations, even in the experimental data about gases. However, I think that Darwin was wrong, C.G. Darwin, because the indeterminacies on the micro level can be magnified and amplified by the kind of amplification instruments that we have in electronics nowadays everywhere. Take the following simple example. I have pictured here the Compton effect, called according to Arthur H. Compton, outstanding American physicist, Nobel Prize winner, who in 1923 did experiments on the impact of photons, X-rays, on electrons. What he found, I cannot go into details, is that while the so-called laws of conservation of energy and momentum are very precisely fulfilled, that was found out a little later, there is no way of predicting the individual occurrence, and all we can say is that while the classical case, namely straight line propagation of the electron under the impact of the X-ray in this direction is still the most probable, others are also probable, although less, and their probabilities are indicated by the length of these arrows within this ellipse, so that it is extremely improbable that it goes off at almost right angles and practically impossible that it goes out at strictly right angles. Of course, a determinist could always say, if you knew further detail about this, you would realize it's only a relative chance and not absolute chance, because who knows how the photon hits the electron. If it's not central impact, we might yet find out a strict order in this. This is prima facie plausible, but if you knew the modern physics, and especially the Heisenberg principle of indeterminacy, you would see that precise location of the electron, together with a precise determination of its momentary momentum or speed, is physically impossible. At least we have excellent experimental evidence for that. We may have to change our mind in the light of new evidence, but for the time being, as of 1963, we haven't got anything better. Now, assume that we put Geiger counters all over the place here, so that it becomes a matter of absolute chance which Geiger counter will be hit by the electron. Hitched to these Geiger counters by way of easy electronic amplification, a doorbell, what you call a light bulb, and a bomb, let's say. It doesn't have to be atomic. So it will depend on absolute chance as to whether a village will be blasted in the air or whether a doorbell will ring, you see. Now you might say, but we have that situation in classical physics already too. Take a billiard ball and hold it straight over the edge of this wedge. Didn't draw it very accurately. Exactly vertically with its center of gravity over the edge of this wedge. Well, if you do this many times, you will find that sometimes it goes down this way and that way. It's like heads and tails with the coin, of course. But a strict determinist can answer the question, what happens if there are no disturbing wind currents, air currents, if the whole thing is done in the vacuum, if this is ideally precise, so that the center of gravity is precisely vertical above the edge here. Well, what would have to happen, according to classical physics, is that the ball would bounce back and with dampened oscillations finally come to rest right on top here. Nobody has seen ever such a thing happen, just as you have probably never seen a dime stand up on edge when you play it on a plain table surface like this, spin it, you see. So in classical physics, there is at least in principle a possibility of approaching strict determinism. Now, if this is true, let's apply that now. We're coming back to the free will problem gradually. Let's apply that to the human situation. I've made up some classroom examples. Oh yeah, what's the one? I still need more space here. That's not Grand Central, that's Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon, the precipice, the abyss, and here is a wanderer in pitch dark night who approaches unknowingly, unwittingly, the Grand Canyon. If nothing else happens, he might meet his death by falling into the abyss. But out here is the ranger's house. The blinds are all drawn, and just a trickle of light comes out here. Now, a famous physiologist, Selig Hecht at Columbia University many years ago, found out that just a few photons, and some physiologists say possibly even one photon, one quantum of light is able to stimulate the rods and cones in our retina. Suppose the wanderer in the pitch dark night gets a glimmer of light. He might then change his direction of walk and get supper, bed, and breakfast at the ranger's house and avoid his death. But as to whether his retina will respond to the incoming photons, according to the quantum theory, is a matter of absolute chance. So in this case, life or death would depend on absolute chance. To be sure, this is a cooked-up artificial example, but you see what I mean. There are many amplifying mechanisms in organisms, including human organisms, and there is a big suspicion that in the transmission of nerve impulses in our nervous system, including in our brain, there may well be quantum indeterminacies involved, and that once in a while something may happen by, as we put it crudely, by absolute chance. Take the following example. Here is a fellow who is on vacation chopping busily wood. You know, those people, what they do on vacation, for vacation exercise. Next to him stands his best friend. A, who's chopping wood, has been thoroughly psychoanalyzed, so we know he has no unconscious grudge against his best friend. But suddenly, something happens. Instead of chopping more wood, he chops down his best friend. Now, would that be free will? Would chance of this sort be free will? Far from it. The man would stand there aghast and would say, for heaven's sake, I never intended to do anything of the sort. And if it could be proved that it was just a sort of quantum fluctuation in the neurons of his brain, I mean in the molecules and atoms of his brain, he would be more easily acquitted than on the basis of temporary insanity, which is often used as a fishy excuse. You see, this sort of absolute chance, while it may provide absolute unpredictability, would not give a basis for moral responsibility at all, quite to the contrary. It would be like the case of compulsion in a certain sense, which indeed, of compulsion, coercion, or constraint, which indeed is rightly used as a basis for acquittal, isn't it? To make up another example, suppose I'm fixing, I never do such things, but suppose I'm fixing the shingles on top of my garage, and somebody is up there with me and in horseplay pushes me down. But down below is a baby in a baby carriage, and with my full weight I crush the poor baby and it's dead. Tough bounce, pardon me. Will I be held responsible? No, I'll say, he done it. I didn't do this, he pushed me off the roof. While I was in midair, I couldn't stop my fall. Under these conditions, I was compelled. The suggestion I offer is the old classical one, that compulsion, not determinism, is the contrary opposite of free choice, the one that we always contrast with it. Compulsion, coercion, constraint. And there are various kinds of constraint. Physical constraint of locomotion. Put me in a small prison cell and my locomotion is severely limited. Physiological constraint. My arm is paralyzed. So much as I wish to lift it, I can't because it isn't functioning physiologically. Psychological constraint or coercion. The condition of certain neurotic compulsives who have to wash their hands all the time. This is a kind of compulsion. Kleptomaniacs, perhaps. There are borderline cases which are touchy to discuss. I understand from psychological evidence that the kleptomaniac, you know, that's the fellow who can't help stealing in department stores, swipes things and puts them under his coat, that the kleptomaniac does not steal when the policeman is right next to him, you see. So he can help it if he's being watched, you see. But when nobody is around, he gives way to his compulsions. So it's a touchy case in this case. There's lots of practical aspects in law and in ethics, as I will point out to you in a moment. I'll try to finish this in a few minutes now. Now, compulsion then is the opposite of free choice. It may be physical, it may be physiological, it may be psychological, as in the case of severe inhibitions, let us say. Somebody wants to talk, but he can't. At best, he may stutter, and so on and so forth. All this can be dealt with, or at least looked at, from a scientific or medical or psychiatric point of view. Then, of course, there are all the social constraints, and their opposite would be the social freedoms or liberties, the civil liberties that we shout so much about, you see. All this is quite logical. Now you might say, what I have explained so far is only freedom from namely freedom from compulsion. It is not freedom for, and perhaps we can say something about that too. Freedom from. You see, when a philosopher, no matter how dignified, gives you a lecture on free will, and he says, with a pastoral ring in his voice, the human will is free. Don't tell him he's right, or don't tell him he's wrong. Ask him to finish his sentence. Free from what and free for what? That will clarify the issue. Just guessing about freedom in general is no good. Modern philosophy should have taught us this kind of lesson, you see. So, ask him what he means, and then he'll come across with the goods. He may say freedom from compulsion, freedom from constraint. He may say freedom for fulfilling our desires, for going after our wishes, or fulfilling our wishes, for fulfilling our ideals. All this may be freedom for. All right? We'll discuss the logic of that one, freedom for, in a moment. But he may, if he is a bad kind of philosopher, from the point of view of my prejudices, of course, I may be wrong, but it's merely for the sake of brevity that I talk so dogmatically, you understand. He may say free from causes. To this, I think physiologists, psychologists, psychiatrists would raise their eyebrows. To be sure, there are countless human actions for which we have thus far no clear causal laws or causal explanations, let alone predictability. Or a few things are predictable, and they are not compulsions at all. The salaried people cash their salary checks pretty regularly. That's predictable and true. They're not under any compulsions to cash them. Nevertheless, they feel free in doing so, you see. So, my conclusion is this, that far from being incompatible with determinism, free choice at least requires a certain degree or measure of determinism, because if you want to analyze what it means to be free for, as well as free from, you have to say, as I said before, that we are the doers of our deeds, that we can be held responsible because we are essential links in the causal chain or causal network of the processes that make up this world of ours. The inference that leads to fatalism, the doctrine of fatalism, is hopelessly confused, because the fatalist says there's nothing we can do about our fate and destiny whatever. It is all predestined. Well, of course, in a certain sense, determinism says just that. But it does not say that in your life you couldn't do anything about your fate. All that we can say from the deterministic point of view is the following. We can say that, for instance, regret, repentance, remorse, although psychologically or phenomenologically retrospective, we say, I wish I hadn't done it, is pragmatically prospective and has really no other meaning. Because if determinism, strict determinism, were true, then what I did on that particular occasion was indeed, in one sense, inevitable. It was the outcome of the total causal process of the world. But that does not mean that we human beings, with the equipment that we have, cannot learn from experience. Regret then means, next time around, when I'm in a similar situation, I'll behave differently. In other words, we are, in our personality and character, which is a set of dispositions, can be analyzed as a set of dispositions, we are flexible, we are educable to the extent that we can learn from the lessons of experience, be they bitter or sweet. Often we don't learn and we make the same mistakes over and over again, as we know, but there is the possibility of learning from experience, and regret then has this practical significance that we make up our minds, and this itself is causally determined, of course, if you look at it from a deterministic point of view, that we make up our minds to behave differently next time. Because next time around we will be either better or wiser, or both, hopefully, and that is then quite in keeping with the deterministic doctrine that a character and personality which has different dispositions will act differently even if the environmental situation is the same. So if I regret having insulted a good friend, then I say, oh, next time around when a similar issue comes up, I will restrain myself and I might succeed. Of course, often we find repeaters, and the psychopathological case where we have psychopathological repeaters, as for instance in certain kinds of criminals, there is an internal compulsion, and these people are better treated as insane than as criminals. We could go on from here to the obvious purposes of punishment, but it's getting late, so I will merely briefly mention that from the point of view of a civilized society and a humane ethics, the purposes of punishment can only be the ones that modern law books generally recommend in their preambles, namely that punishment is not to be interpreted as retribution or retaliation, but that punishment may, in some cases, achieve a reform of the person punished, or if that is out of the question, as in the case of deep psychopathology, then at least incarcerating the person as if he were a wild beast will prevent him from doing the same sort of crime again. And also, we want to establish examples in order to deter others from this behavior. All these three purposes of punishment, whichever is applicable, is understandable, I submit, only from a deterministic point of view, because only if there are psychological laws of a fairly high degree of determinism can you expect that punishment will have these effects. We are talking the language of cause and effect all the time. Perhaps this is sufficient to indicate how the old puzzle of free will and determinism can be resolved. Just one more illustration of what one might mean scientifically by freedom and determinism in various examples. Suppose we take something like Spinoza's example, the round stone rolling down the hillside. Common speech would say it's bound to roll down. The friction is not great enough to hold it in place. It's bound to, it must roll down. All we mean to say by that scientifically is, given these conditions, it is reliably predictable that this ball or stone will roll down. But replace the ball by a rabbit, and it can hold itself in place. It can even walk uphill. So here we have already a difference. Replace the rabbit by a human being who sits on the hillside and may think about the immortality of the June bugs, or write a poem or a symphony or whatnot. So there are more degrees of freedom in a sense, although he might not be able to walk as fast uphill as the rabbit, you see. In that respect, he might be inferior. Now, what do we mean by degrees of freedom? It's almost like the scientific concept that is used in physics. Namely, that internal conditions predominate over the external ones in the determination of the behavior. Given the slope of this hill, given the coefficient of friction, we can predict that the billiard ball will roll down. Given the rabbit on the hillside, and if we knew its internal conditions, which we know only very incompletely, we could predict what it will do, go uphill, rub its forehead with a paw or something like that, and given a complete knowledge of the neurological processes in the human being, we might be able to predict what he will do and what he will say. This is, of course, a tremendous extrapolation indicated by the wavy arrow here. So I think there is, in a sense, a certain, even a behavioristic way of characterizing what we mean by freedom. Relative independence of the external conditions and predominance of the internal ones. This is what makes us the doers of our deeds. Now, we do hold each other morally responsible in a civilized society. What does this mean? The word responsible, the adjective responsible, is used in a variety of ways, often quite loosely, even in connection with inorganic processes. A river is suddenly out of its original bed and runs a different course. You ask, what's responsible for that, this change? Well, I can tell you, a landslide. caused by an earthquake in turn. This is what caused the river to change its course. That's easy. But this is not what we mean by moral responsibility. You can't hold the hill responsible for crumbling down, you know. Responsibility on the human level means, as I said before, responsiveness to the sanctions that society can offer, to the rewards and punishments in the widest sense of the word that society has at its disposal. So this is what we mean by responsibility. What do we mean then by freedom? This is a touchy issue if you look at it from an ethical point of view. Because you've got to define what is the core of the personality, which is to express itself in its actions. I'm using here almost literally the Spinoza definition of freedom, namely that a being is free to the extent that it expresses its inner nature in its actions. Now, I think this can be worked out in a scientific way. We'd have to say that what is that inner core of the personality? And here, of course, we may get different answers. This is a problem of ethics, which is not under discussion here. I merely want to mention by way of footnote that we might have differences here, namely, for instance, between the Puritans and the Cavaliers. The Puritan would say the real essence, the essential core of the human person is reason. The Cavalier might say, no, it's passions. As a matter of fact, the great British philosopher Hume was a Cavalier in that sense. Famous passage in one of his books is, reason is and should be the slave of the passions. But he was a very noble mind. He didn't have any sybaritism at all in mind. Now, so you could have a conversation between Puritans and Cavaliers where the Cavalier finds that the poor Puritan is the victim of compulsions, neurotic ones maybe. But the tables can be turned because the Puritan can tell the Cavalier, poor Cavalier, he is a victim of his passions. His reason cannot act out. These are questions of value judgments. Let's not discuss this primarily because I don't have too much to say on problems of ethical theory. And what I say is so subversive that we'd better not talk about it. But one last word. If you still feel uncomfortable, and I wouldn't blame you in the least about this whole problem, namely, if there is strict determinism in nature, in some sense, all our actions, even our deliberations, our making choices are predetermined. So you might feel I haven't really pulled the essential sting of the problem. The scientific evidence, ever since the great synthesis, the Newtonian synthesis of the 17th century of Laplace, and I could read in that world formula the calendar of my life, the calendar of events. On Wednesday morning, I will do this, and my hand will move this way over the paper, and so on and so forth. Every detail, you know, a ghastly idea, worthy of 1984 or whatever it is. I don't think I would have the feeling of freedom. So I think the feeling of freedom, not the fact of freedom, please, but the sentiment, the feeling of freedom is essentially connected with our ignorance. The second remedy I can offer is that it is quite possible that indeterminism is here to stay. And while this does not by itself give you freedom, it will remove the specter of strict predictability. Because if you take any decent length of time and you want to predict anything as complex as human activity, then even on theoretical grounds, such as we have in modern physics, things get so blurred all over the place as far as prediction is concerned that you wouldn't be able to predict the details. Although, due to mass action, due to purpose and set and cybernetic aspects of the processes in organisms, there's a lot that can be predicted about the general tendencies and stabilizations that go on in organisms. I think I should stop here because I've talked already much longer than I intended, and you've been very patient and kind. To sum up, what I've tried to do in a rather compressed form is to show you that one of the great riddles of the universe that has plagued many philosophers throughout the ages can be attacked by separating out the logical issues, the relation of the concepts of free choice, determinism, indeterminism, compulsion, and fatalism, by distinguishing them clearly and seeing the relations that actually hold among them. And secondly, by attention to what modern science has to tell us about the details of determination in the inorganic, the micro, the macro world, the organic world, the mental world, and so on. This is unfinished business, but that's part of science, and science has always been the endless quest. Perhaps philosophy, too, is an endless quest, but I do think that there are some problems of philosophy, and I count the core of the free will problem among them. There are some problems of philosophy which can be dissolved with finality and need no longer cause us particular philosophical headaches. Thank you.